Nice of you guys to join us.
So Ben and Leanne, if you'll introduce yourselves and Jericho Solutions as a kind of the beginning of this video, it'd be great. And then go ahead and jump on in.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much for having us. We're excited to be partners with Healthy Growing Churches. And obviously, thanks for taking a time out today to be on here and listen to what we have to say. So we'll get started.
We're going to go ahead and share our screen with you here. Okay, so yeah, we're just so excited to share what God has been teaching us for the past 20 years and how it is part of what we believe is the great multiplication movement. Churches everywhere are asking questions and making changes to be better at making disciples. And we believe how churches serve their communities is a huge part of this.
So a little bit about our backgrounds, which lays the foundation for the ideas we're going to share. In his early 20s, Ben was an entrepreneur and started his first business and has done so many times since. And he's really intrigued with processes and systems and finding the perfect ways to market businesses. And that really set him up and equipped him for this calling. I started out with a passion to be in ministry, but God kept literally bringing people into my life with different job opportunities that really gave me some different experiences. Social work and challenge school districts, community mobilizing, program development and evaluation, government, in a variety of different nonprofit settings over 17 years. And really my position before we got into full-time ministry was with the third largest United Way in the country. And there I got a great look at how most things, and I was exposed to literally hundreds of different programs from domestic violence, shelter to after-school programs.
Okay, all right, well, we'll keep trucking with it. God just help this internet connection to stay stable, help us today here. So,
we shared a little bit about our background. Did you hear that?
Yes, we did.
Okay. All right, so for this session, the way we designed it is that we'll talk a little bit about outreach and different ideas that we have, and just save Q&A for the end, if that's all right. There's also a part where we ask you to write down a couple things to think through it. So you may want paper and pencil out if you don't have that handy. Just a heads up. But by the end of the session, really our objectives are two things: to help you have a better understanding of how outreach is really your church's key strategy for making disciples, and how to identify critical shifts that need to happen to maximize your church's potential.
Yeah, so right now there's a gap, and it's a big one, between most people in a community and the church. I don't know where you are on agreeing with that statement, but if we look at media statistics, church attendance, compared to your total community population, the next generation's participation in the church, and in doing so, I think we can agree that we as the church have not reached our full potential yet. We believe there are two reasons why this is true. First, while the church has continued to get better and better at doing great services and programs, people outside the church have grown more and more skeptical, are too broken, and are less likely than ever to accept our invitations, at least without relationships being built first. Second, the church lacks a plan and process to take its ministry outside its walls.
So before I began working inside churches 5 years ago, I spent 15 years in agencies and in community meetings that highlighted for me the need for the church. So let me explain. I'd be in a committee meeting, and there'd be representatives from all different sectors of the community: education, government, parents, law enforcement, youth workers, etc. And we'd be talking about some community issue: suicide, the heroin epidemic, graduation rates. And inevitably, someone would ask, where is the faith community and how do we utilize that group of people? And this always bothered me because I'd grown up in the church and I knew that we had the only real solution for that community problem. But I just continued to keep finding myself in that situation over and over. And what I began to realize is that the community does not know how to involve the church, and the church didn't know how to be involved in the community. Later on, I started working inside of a church in Kentucky, and they were really interested in taking their church outside their walls. And, one of the first things I noticed is that our congregation had a heart for the homeless. So I went to the homeless shelter to learn more about their needs and if there were ways that we could partner. And the first conversation I had with the director, Rachel, she told me that they were the only shelter in the region that kept husbands and wives together, and they were the only shelter in the region that would take in even the intoxicated. And I thought, wow, what a great mission. And I asked her, do a lot of churches currently help your organization? Thinking maybe our church was just late to the game. And her response was, yes, churches are great to drop off supplies and provide donations, but we do struggle to find people willing to provide hospitality to our guests. And her response, it broke my heart. And I vowed that day that I would do what I could to change that. With all our hearts, we really do believe that the church wants to make a difference in their communities. And so 5 years ago, really, we shifted our focus to try to figure out what keeps churches from being leaders in their community. We know that they want to bring change. They want to be key influencers. But we've kind of studied what some of the barriers are, and we're going to share a little bit about that with you before we shift into a solution. Now, I'm going to talk in generalities, and this might not explain your church, and it might not be true in all cases, but just some trends that we've seen really digging into this. A church's typical approach to serving their community in their outreach. Now, I know those terms are used very differently in different settings by different people, so I'm just going to real quick give us an operational definition that we're meaning. And it might differ from yours, but that's okay. This is what we're talking about, at least in the session. So outreach, an effort to bring services or information to people where they live or spend time. Serving, using our time, talents, and energy to help others. So with those definitions in mind, I'm going to talk just a little bit about some of the typical responses or ways of putting together these programs that I've seen. One of the things I've seen a lot is that churches respond to invitations, which some of the things we're doing as a church are because people ask us to do it, which is great. We responded to a real need. If your church has a reputation for helping and caring, obviously that's going to be step one. But what happens when we just keep doing that without any strategic direction or way to decide which invitations are good and which invitations are best for our church? Well, that's where a lot of churches are right now. They have a bunch of really helpful activities, and those activities are really appreciated by their community, but they really aren't moving the needle. And when I say that, I mean that they're not helping those we're serving in the best ways. They aren't furthering the cause that we're really concerned about, and they really aren't helping our church either in any way. The second approach that I see is happening is that we respond or react to problems. And, this is, we watch the news, we care about something, and we want to help. And I firmly believe that God loves those who are touched in the act. I think that we should be doing that, and there's definitely a time for that. But we really believe God is calling churches right now to be effective and organize and strategize and really take ground in their communities. And I think we all know and understand that you don't solve hunger with food drives. And you definitely aren't addressing the root issues that cause people to be hungry, but yet a lot of our approaches are still lining up with reacting to problems. One of the other things that happen a lot is that we partner with the obvious allies. And what I mean by that is other Christian organizations. And definitely on one hand, when I see Christians working together across the city or town, it's beautiful and we should be working together. And unity is a powerful message to unbelievers. But if a church is only partnering with faith organizations and Christian colleges, they really aren't maximizing their church organizational influence. And so that's one of those things that's maybe it's good, but we need to make sure we have other strategies in place.
So we really like this quote. It says, "We are kept from our goal, not by obstacles, but by a clear path to a lesser goal." And so surely explain this way, you see the problems with these approaches. As churches, we have sometimes settled for lesser goals. By using these approaches, a church ends up with a piecemeal list of often unrelated activities that may not support where you are leading. They may not represent what you are teaching, and they may not be effective and may not be meeting needs in the best way. When your outreach approach is the passion of one person or one small group, it won't likely inspire enough or be sustainable. The bottom line is unstrategic outreaches may even deepen the belief too many have that the church is ineffective. It's clear where the church has placed its focus, building into the flock, and this has been hugely successful. Fantastic pastors around the country, love their congregation and have done amazing jobs at what they do. But new times require a new focus. An additional focus. And we believe God has been using churches and dedicated pastors and teachers to equip the body of Christ for such a time as this. And our world is ready for us. Many great things are in place to do this, to help our neighbor. And we believe churches, in many cases, just haven't had the plan to reach outside of their walls in the most effective ways. And so go ahead and grab your pencil for a minute, or just think about this and take a few seconds to jot down a few words you would use to describe the spiritual state of your community around your church. So, words like broken, hopeless, misled, selfish, angry, confused, sheep without a shepherd. These are the words that come to my mind. Certainly not inside of the church, but outside of the church walls. And I ask you, what is the appropriate response to this condition? It cannot be that the church continues to do what it's always done, the ways it's always done them. So who's going after those far from God? The interesting dynamic is that the furthest from God are often the most open to him. And when you teach your congregation the truth and the gospel and you pray for a broken world, it makes sense to no one that urgent action does not follow. I chose the Cambridge definition of outreach because it includes where they live or spend time. You know the Great Commission better than me. We are to go, and the way we go matters. This means we cannot afford to sit out on community conversations. We can't let our congregants be content with Sundays, and basic needs in our backyards cannot go unmet because it reflects the very image of God.
So
You're back. It paused for just a second there. Or I thought you were. Sorry for the technical difficulties. This regularly scheduled program will be back in just a moment. Did you guys write down any words? I'm really interested in the words on the spiritual state of your community. I'd love for you guys to think about that, because I was trying to quickly jot some things down. I was glad he gave me some hints on what that was. Anybody want to chime in on thoughts while we wait?
I will. The first word I wrote down was religious. We are the town we're in is very Catholic, so there's not a lot of regular attenders to the worship services and masses, but there's about 70% of the people that I approach are, oh well, I'm Catholic. We invite them anyway. So actually, our worship leader is actually, he grew up Catholic, then became Methodist, and now he's with us. So so we're finding ways to speak into that. Sure.
Cool. And being from Louisiana, I can attest to that. I've heard that a few times. One of the words that I saw on the slide was angry and selfish, and that I see that from time to time in the South. How about you guys? Do you see any other words that you connect with?
My community is a lot like Steve's, I think. I would use the word empty, just empty.
Nice. So if I can, religious and empty, what are you guys seeing that's being effective about fighting that?
Well, for me, it's been just the personal touch. I mean, the word genuine and authentic are words that the folks that we're reaching, they use all the time, and telling others about what we're doing. And I think that's where, the emptiness comes from. Religion that's just a ritual and going through the motions, which a lot of folks in our community have that as their experience. And so I think that what we've been doing to come against that is just being real with people. And I think that's what's bringing about what we're seeing in our small church plant team, some great things and spiritual growth happening as they've, in their own words, are saying, this is so genuine. I've never been a part of anything like this. And I just say, well, this is what we do. This is church. We are the church. It's not a place you go. It's who we are. And that's really, that's the heart of it. That's making a difference in our small groups so far. So we're hoping, our prayer is that grows.
Exciting.
We'll grow in our relationships and doing that.
Cool. Sounds good. So Ben and Leanne,
sorry to interrupt.
No, we were just talking about spiritual state of our community and hearing words like religious and empty, and continue that conversation that you guys started. So that's what we were doing while you were kicking the squirrels to get the internet happening.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So why does it really matter? I'm just posing that question to you. Why does it really matter if our outreach strategies are effective? Well, we can agree sin's out of control, that the church is the only true answer. And people who don't, the people that don't know Jesus are really who we're called to. And I know we all believe that. But one thing we probably haven't thought about is how important outreach is to the people that we're trying to reach. I believe that actually this is your number one strategy for mobilizing your disciples, and that some of the things that you worry about as a church leadership actually become addressed when you are doing effective outreach. Examples of that are, we teach and we hope people, take those teachings seriously and put them into action. But without the proper channels and the organization to do that, unfortunately, a lot of people don't. And so really taking on a new charge as a church to help people take those steps.
So we could spend days talking about what's not working. And our goal in discussing that was only to get us all on the same page. That what got us here, it won't get us there. Not in today's world. And whether you're dieting or raising kids, that knowing what not to do is not near as important as knowing what to do. So let's shift to talking about that. Hopefully we all agree that an effective approach in anything is important. And as we plan activities and initiatives at our church, we must have a clear idea of what we want to accomplish. Let's assume that all of us are striving to make disciples that make disciples. And when you place that goal in the context of your community in America in 2017, this looks different than it did years before. You may not believe the goal of outreach or serving is discipleship. And if that's you, it's likely because the outreaches you've seen did not have the potential to accomplish that. And we are proposing outreaches can and should lead to disciple making. To get there, a church must evaluate and adjust outreach efforts to reach their maximum potential.
All right, so what does an effective outreach look like? I'm going to share some examples. A few years ago, we were part of a 50-year-old church that had about 2,500 people in Kentucky, and they had a wonderful family of believers, and they were interested in mobilizing outside their walls into the community. They had 40 mission partners. A lot of those were local, and they had made sizable investments in a lot of different ways in the community and around the world. They were known for being a stable place to worship, and they had great preaching, and so they were steady. But they weren't reaching young families as well as they'd used to, and they were really ready for more. The same time that they were shifting to have more of an outward focus, they also were planning the opening of a second campus that was across the same county. So what we did was we looked at the strengths of that church and the needs of that county, and we designed an outreach that was new to them called Tent Day. We named it that because we literally set up tents in communities. Essentially, each of the campuses, 2 campuses, adopted an under-resourced community within 5 miles of their church, the church building. Every week, year-round, ongoing teams found creative ways to build relationships and meet needs. Because certain components were in place, what some may just call a block party was more than fun. It was a platform for relationship building. And in 1 year, some of those relationships had already led to deep discipleship. And now in year 4, there are many stories of lives who've been transformed because an incredible family of believers didn't wait for people far from God to come to them or their buildings. They took the family to them. So now I want to share 7 different components that as we tease out what's effective in outreach and what's not, the ones that are really building relationships that have discipleship potential seem to have these 7 ingredients. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those, and I'll weave the Tent Day model through that just to give you some example real life real life examples. All right, so the first one is that the activity we chose, we really felt like was joining God in what he was doing in our community. So I'm not going to say a lot about this because I think it goes without saying that we should be joining God, not asking him to join us. But the idea was that there's so many ways in your community you can be Jesus. And so it was really important to us to determine the best ways and places that we were equipped as a church to do that. So prayer was involved, of course. Being part of the community to get a sense of what was important and what was missing was another key factor. And I'm definitely not saying pastors should be in every meeting in the community, but it really is important to have people on your leadership team and lay leaders that are really entrenched in the community and understand the community well. With Tent Day, even before we started, we had many informal conversations with people about what to do and how to do it. And we also felt like it was doing something that nobody else was doing in our community. But the joining God part really came because there was a prayer group that preceded these activities that had been praying, God, please show us what our role of a church as a church is. And we really felt like we stepped into that. The neat part about that is when you're stepping into what God's doing, then you also have the favor and the open doors, spiritual warfare as well, of course, but a lot of things happened that we wouldn't have expected because we really felt like we were joining God and what he was asking us to do. So I would say any effective outreach definitely have to have the God factor involved. Another key piece is that an effective outreach has to empower people. And we know that, but sometimes I don't think we understand the subtleties of what we're doing and how that matters and how that communicates empowerment. We're also talking about it must empower the people serving and the people being served. So utilizing the kind of practices that maybe you've read about and things like toxic charity, understanding poverty, helping without hurting, those kinds of resources are great. But we really had a heart to give a hand up, not a hand out, and leave people better as a result. Our goal was to build friendships, not dependencies. And at Tent Day, even though there was a lot of needs, we intentionally invited the residents to be part of our teams. So there was never an us versus them dynamic that was set up. And, that really made a difference. We did little things, just to give you examples, like we didn't all show up in our matching church t-shirts. We didn't assume the needs, but we learned about needs because there were many of them through conversations, and we organized in meaningful ways around those needs instead of just bringing handouts and creating that dynamic of being a delivery of goods. We felt like our best gift was our friendship and our time. God really did work in hearts because that approach, I think, was in place. And, we have great stories of extremely awkward teenagers that became mentors and leaders within their community because we didn't just see them as recipients, we saw them as part of the process that God was doing there. And that's really what we mean by empowerment. Another piece that's really important is that if you're doing something as a church, it needs to really challenge your believers to live out their faith. I think we make it too easy on people sometimes. Just donate things, just show up once, that kind of thing. So, I guess all of us have probably seen the phenomenon that happens on a mission trip where people, are really challenged and stretched in new ways. And it doesn't have to happen occasionally with a few. Having effective local outreaches really do stretch people. And so we've got to make sure we have that factor built in. I know when I'm face to face with someone who is struggling and I cannot fix it, it really forces me to dig deep and decide what I believe about God and how to share that. And so that same environment will do that for the people of a church. And that's an important part of their faith journey. I think effective outreaches really provide space to explore life missions. So maybe people are wondering, like, what's my purpose and how do I add to God's kingdom? And when we give them a variety of ways to do that. They definitely can explore that better.
Yeah, so another one is investing long term. We had many naysayers when we announced we'd be doing 10 day every week forever. And even local ministry leaders said it would be impossible to get that many volunteers for that long. And there were budget concerns too. But the way we felt the Spirit leading was weekly. The frequency is important because it is almost impossible to build relationships with people who you are rarely with, and depending on your church's resources, that determines the type of outreach it is, etc. But frequency is very important. Property managers at both sides, where we did 10 days, shared stories of how churches came sometimes for events or for a while, but fizzled out. They did not expect us to last long. Sadly, the residents didn't either. And there was probably no other single factor that convinced them of our hearts any better than continuing to show up and going into that outreach with that being just absolute priority of ours. That changed everything. And so, 4 years later, people's lives are being changed dramatically every week. This set us up. This set us up for discipleship beautifully. And so the next example is Coalescence of Efforts. The vision God has given your church and your outreach efforts should align. This church was about reaching the community, reaching the next generation, connecting people to needed resources and their life mission. And the church also had the capacity to do something big. Their goal is to engage hundreds of the congregation, involving those who didn't connect with some of the typical ways to serve. We wanted to involve men and seniors, give youth meaningful ways to serve. And so the 10-day strategy was a great one for that specific church. Seniors often organized and provided home-cooked food for 10-day. As repair needs emerged, handymen from the church were connected to single moms to help. We were able to enhance the outdoor spaces with shelters and sports equipment and really make these communities ours because we were intentional about building relationships with a certain group of people. When Christmas rolled around, we didn't have to rely on other organizations to give our donations to help families. We knew them and could connect in respectful, meaningful ways. Because this church wasn't afraid to pursue partnerships, much of this was accomplished with the help of local businesses, entrepreneurs, schools, and agencies. The church led the effort, but many made it possible. Recently, the executive pastor of that church told us that before they launch a third campus, they intend to begin a 10-day first to build relationships and invest in a community long before they have a Sunday gathering. Because the entire community around that neighborhood and the church, they take notice and they see what's going on and they see the good things that the church is doing.
So another component of successful outreaches is high relationship potential. And we've touched on this a lot already. It's pretty simple. If something doesn't happen often enough or allow you to connect with the same people over time, it does not have high relationship potential. If an activity didn't allow us to build relationships, we certainly could not expect it to lead to discipleship. One church planter told me that serving the community is something the church should do once there is a church to mobilize. I understand where he's coming from. So many outreach efforts have lacked the right ingredients, so they've been deemed ineffective in growing a church. And while I'm not saying that we serve our community to build our church, we do serve our community to grow the church. And so, we really aren't proposing a social gospel. We don't believe that compassion and good works saves. We know that Jesus saves, but we also know that there's faith without deed. When there's faith without deeds, that it's a dead faith. And we don't feel comfortable proclaiming the word of God without also having the authentic incarnation that goes with that. People's needs drove them to Jesus, and we know that needs should drive them to us as the church. And if Jesus didn't ignore physical needs, then we know that we shouldn't either. But the reality of that is that relationships are always the best context to meet real needs in.
So the overlap of community needs and church gifts. This church who went to these communities has humble hearts. They've been faithfully taught God's word through worship services, Bible studies, small groups. Their in-house discipleship programs were extremely effective. They were ready to be sent out. Those who study poverty say one of the worst parts of living in poverty is the isolation. And the relationships that do exist are sometimes unhealthy. By becoming friends and family, the greatest needs are being met. I think of Allison, a widow from the church, who made some incredibly good pancakes for our Saturday morning winter tent days. She joyfully filled her truck with those who wanted to come to church with her. 10 Day is a part of her faith journey. When we started this ministry, the scripture, 2 Corinthians 8:14, at the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn, their plenty will supply what you need. It was as much about Allison as it was the people she went to serve. And so what if what we need to be more like Jesus, it depends on us knowing the people across town whose paths we will not cross because we are segregated by so much. Whatever God has given your church, He intends for you to use it.
All right, so we've talked a lot of philosophy here, and we've talked about a lot of concepts. So how does this actually work? So now you're going to have to do a little bit of work here. So we're going to put up on the screen, we just talked about these 7 components. They so cleverly also have the acronym Jericho. Isn't that clever? So each one of these we just talked about and gave you some examples, these 7 components. Now what I'd like to do is let us take one common example that I would say most churches in America have some kind of thing like it, a Thanksgiving box project. And let's just put it through some of these concepts and see how it, see if it has discipleship potential. All right, so if you've got paper, you can just kind of score Thanksgiving boxes on your own. There's a scale at the top, 0 to 5, 0 being not great at all, doesn't do it at all, and 5 being outstanding. And so for the first one, joining God, you may not know that one, you can make a guess, but just score each category across, and I'll give you a couple minutes to do that.
How strategic do you think the Thanksgiving boxes is?
Oh, let me tell you how this Thanksgiving box project works, because they're all different. All right, so this church is partnering with the county food bank to help families with Thanksgiving meals. A list of food items were distributed in the bulletin, and people were encouraged to drop the items off in bins at church. Once they're received, they'll be distributed by the food bank to needy families. That's how this one is. So just rate that one. I'll give you a few minutes. All right, so for the sake of time, we'll keep moving. So you might have scored it differently than me, but my scores add up to 10, and the possible score is 35. So this activity scores low on a couple things: relationship potential, empowering people, investing long-term. We assume some things there. But what if I told you that there was a church that also did Thanksgiving help, that did it a little bit differently? So there's a church that we know in Cincinnati, Ohio, and this is how they do their Thanksgiving outreach. They have a Thanksgiving store They focus on 20 families in their community that they already have a relationship with. The congregation stocks the shelves and helps the families shop, and the families purchase the items themselves for pennies on the dollar. These same families come to Bible studies and various classes throughout the week because the church has turned itself into a community center for families in their community. So with these tweaks, I think we would all score it very differently. It would score much higher. So one thing that we're suggesting is that churches can take a look at their existing outreaches and just have some great conversations about which ones are helping them reach their goals as a church, but also which ones have discipleship potential. By using a tool like this, a church can get a sense of what activities may lead to discipleship. We aren't saying a church can only do ones that have a certain score, and it's certainly not meant to be used that way. But if none of the efforts have discipleship potential, it definitely may be something worth considering or doing something a little bit different. So looking at existing activities is obviously just one piece of many things that a church could do to align and maximize its efforts. Other important pieces that we have found are that churches need to understand their community needs, and that can be done through different types of assessments. Also, it's important that churches really understand their gifts as a church. If you know what you're good at and how God's gifted you as a church, those are great clues on
specific to outreach.
Yeah, specific to outreach are great clues. For example, if you have a great space, utilizing your space as our outreach tool might be something that your church should be doing. It may not, but I mean, some of those are clues. Determining partnerships in your church's role. I definitely have seen examples of churches leading well and churches partnering well and churches supporting well. And so a church isn't going to lead every effort, but really knowing the community and knowing where the gaps are and how you're designed as a church is really key. When you start to do ministry, especially with certain populations, whether you're reaching out to someone of a different culture or you're focusing on kids or whatever that is, there's training that's involved in that. And so that's another key piece that we didn't touch on, but that's really key to serving a community well. And building plans. We mentioned several times that churches, sort of pushing churches and encourage churches to be more strategic and to execute maybe less things, but more things well. And then really measuring and celebrating success. That's key. One of the things I learned when I worked for United Way was, unfortunately, a lot of the big funders and organizations in town didn't think what the church was doing was very effective. And a lot of that was based on the fact that they couldn't show outcomes and they couldn't show how they're making a difference. And so, implementing things that are effective in great ways is a huge shift that we need to make. All right.
So we want to wrap up this presentation with this quote. It says, it's from Francis Chan, we reduce discipleship to a canned program. And so many in the church end up sidelined in a spectator mentality that delegates disciple making to pastors and professionals, ministers and missionaries. But this is not the way it's supposed to be. And I think we can all agree that this is the last place we want our churches to be in. We're so excited to think about churches across the country finding their place in their community in new and exciting and effective ways, and using the tools they have to change lives here and for eternity.
All right, well, that's the end of our formal presentation, but definitely like to open it up to Q&A.
You want to go ahead and stop sharing the screen if you don't mind?
Yeah. There we go.
Awesome. That was really good. I took a lot of notes. The inviting the community to help out, I thought was really brilliant. I know we've done a lot of things downtown with those communities that need things and we know about, and we know that we're providing some help, but inviting them in the community to be part of that process. Would you talk to that for just a few seconds?
Sure. I think it's easier if we use a concrete example. So from the beginning, when we showed up into a community, we were asking questions and we were inviting people to be on our serving team. So we had a lot of residents that week 2 showed up early to help us set up and help us serve. And, you know, they got volunteer name tags, just like the people from our church. And we had a lot of kids that wanted to be involved. And it was incredible to see just the ownership and the excitement. You know, one of the guys said, "Oh, I can help out. I can show up early and get the grill going before you guys get here." Or, you know, there's people that jumped in. We had a teenager from the beginning who wore headphones week after week after week. And a few months in, she was the one organizing all of the activities for the kids, which was beautiful because she was there in that neighborhood every day. We were there once a week. She went on to, and she was so quiet and shy, but she went on to end up teaching kids classes at one of our campuses, and a lady mentored her from there. And it was really beautiful to see how her life changed. Her family actually moved out of the mobile home community, but they continued to come back weekly to be part of the team, which I thought was pretty incredible. So, you know, for those people that that really said yes, it was life-changing, you know, for them to be part of something.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Others, jump in. Let's ask some more questions.
Yeah, you know, so many times, you know, we find ourselves as a church, we'll go to let's say a homeless shelter to serve meals. And, you know, so many times we will be on the side of the table that's serving the meals. But if we sent a group of people to that homeless ministry, and half of those people were designed to serve the meals, the other half were designed to be on the side of the table with the people. And then delegate those up. Hey, we've got these plastic forks, you know, we're handing out. Would you mind handing these out for us? You know, that kind of thing. Just being intentional about that is really the key to build and design programs where that's built into those programs, where there's the opportunity for those things to happen.
So one of the other things I heard you say was grading your activities, and I think that's really good. I know that I was on staff at a church that had way too many things going on, and you know, having a matrix and a process for grading those, and doing this unheard of concept, and that is doing doing fewer things. What a concept! So have you seen that work well, or do you see people actually letting go of outreaches that are grading poorly?
I think it's really hard because we have the list of things that we do, because usually it was somebody's passion, and we've done it for years and we're known for that. And so it's really hard to let things go. I think where I've seen the most success is where people have a new vision that you know is so much bigger, and that you can step towards something and let some things sort of die. I think maybe you guys have read the book Necessary Endings. That's what comes to mind right now, is that, you know, I think as churches, we're not saying do more. We're just saying be more effective. And so that's hard to do, but I do see churches doing that, and it's encouraging. That sometimes means saying, I'm sorry, we can't fund you anymore, local pregnancy center, or, you know, those are not easy conversations at all. And certainly we want those things to continue. One of the things that as we moved away from some local partners, and it, you know, gave us more capacity to do some other things, but we found ways to say yes to those organizations, but it just looked really different. And so
yeah, so let's say you have, you go through an assessment that determines where your church is gifted in outreach. a good way to kind of wrap up some of those smaller programs that have been built in a church throughout the years is to build one program where a lot of those different programs can then play a part in that program, in that one program. And that way those groups of people and that person still can utilize their skills, but it's for a very specific end result, a very specific objective. And so that's a way to kind of condense a lot of different programs into a few.
Can you give us some ideas on how to assess where we're good? What tools, what ideas are you using? The other thing I was interested in is how you're listening to the community. Where do you go? Who are you talking to? How are you going about that?
Well, I think I'll start with your second question. I think every community is a little bit different, but there's probably a starter set of easy go-tos. It's the school system that you're connected to, law enforcement. If there's community collaborations that already exist, and maybe you're hearing the same things over and over, and maybe those aren't. Probably in every community you have hungry kids and addiction and some of these topics that come up. So I think it's taking a look at that and seeing where the passion is. But I think it's also saying who's doing what and where are there huge gaps that may or may not be your church's calling, but it's a really good key. The other thing I would suggest in that is not thinking too small. I think that a lot of times we've started with a program instead of starting with a passion. So I'll give you an example. We'll say, I've heard that kids can't read, so let's start a reading program. That's not very invitational, number one, to our congregation, not very inspirational. But what if we started with this bigger picture of, we want to make sure that the kids in our area can read. We want to tackle literacy. What are those stats in our community that we can really move the needle on, and putting that as the big picture instead of maybe just a program. As far as tools, we're developing some tools right now because I think there is a need for that. I know, I'm pretty sure, Dave, you've used some tools as well, but that's something like to be determined for us. Like, we're developing some tools right now for churches to use.
And a lot of that is just research into your community. What are those big needs in your community? For instance, in Cincinnati, it was heroin. Heroin is just taking over that country here, or that area. Here in Jacksonville, it's sex trafficking. And so, there's a few of these highlighted issues that you might be able to give your church a survey on. Which area are we most skilled at? And so it might not be the number one area. It might not be heroin, but it might be, child hunger in your area, or, whatever that area is that your church really feels passionate about. And then discovering all of the ways that you can go about building programs to do that effectively.
Well, Ben and Leanne, I'm going to cut you off because we're about to hit 3 o'clock. I know we had a few technical challenges today,
Yeah,
but
I apologize.
I'm very grateful for the words of wisdom that you had for us and the challenges to be more effective in our communities. Looking forward to hearing more from you guys and finding more resources. And hopefully all those books that you blew by so quickly, Leanne, you just kind of rattled off. Hopefully we'll get a list of those out there for guys, because I know that you guys are in this full time. So thank you very much. And we look forward to hearing more from you guys. So God bless you guys. And that will officially end the call.
All right. Have a great day. Thank you.